Evan Brooks stood motionless in the courtroom, his pale blue eyes fixed on the floor, moments before the verdict that would shatter his life forever. The townspeople of Willow Creek thought they knew him a quiet handyman with steady hands and a lonely house at the edge of the woods, but by the end of that trial, they would realize how little anyone truly knew about the man now known as the defendant who went mad after the verdict. The town of Willow Creek sat quietly between two low mountain ranges, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. It had one main street, 3 diners, and a gas station that doubled as a gossip hub. Life there was predictable, comfortable, even. People waved when they passed each other on the road, and the loudest thing anyone usually heard after sunset was the sound of crickets. But one morning, that piece cracked wide open. It started when Martin Hale, the owner of Holly's Antiques, didn't open his shop. By mid-morning, his assistant grew worried and called the sheriff. When deputies arrived, they found the front door locked but the back door slightly ajar. Inside, the store looked like a storm had hit it. Glass cases were shattered, drawers pulled out, and Martin was lying on the floor behind the counter. The antique clock above him had stopped ticking at 11:40 to the night before. The sheriff, a man named Tom Whitaker, had known Martin for 20 years. He couldn't understand who would hurt him. Martin was friendly, generous, and one of the few people in town who had no enemies, at least that's what everyone thought. The news spread like wildfire. People gathered in small clusters outside the yellow police tape, whispering guesses and fears. In a town where everyone's lives were woven together, the thought that one of their own might be capable of murder was almost too much to believe. Later that afternoon, investigators began piecing together the evidence. A drawer in the back office had been forced open, and a few old coins were missing, along with about $2,000 in cash. It looked like a robbery, but something about the scene didn't feel right. There was no sign of forced entry on the front door, and the back door showed signs of being repaired recently. When the crime lab processed the fingerprints, one clear set stood out belonging to Evan Brooks. Evan was a local handyman who took on small repair jobs around town. He lived alone in a small house near the edge of the woods. People described him as quiet, polite, and maybe a little strange. He rarely joined town gatherings, but when someone needed help fixing a leaky roof or a broken window, Evan was always there. He had done some carpentry work for Martin just a week earlier, including fixing the back door where the police found his fingerprints. The discovery of his prints was enough for suspicion to grow. The sheriff, uneasy but bound by procedure, brought Evan in for questioning. Some said he looked confused, others swore he didn't seem surprised at all. By evening, word had spread that Evan Brooks had been arrested for Martin Holly's murder. People who once waved to him at the diner now locked their doors when they heard his name. Still, there were a few who doubted the story. They remembered that Evan had always been the kind of man who helped others without asking for much. But in Willow Creek, rumors moved faster than facts, and soon everyone had their own version of what happened that night. The peace the town once had was gone, replaced by suspicion, fear, and the uneasy feeling that the truth was far more complicated than anyone wanted to believe. The trial of Evan Brooks began on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the sky looked heavy enough to rain but never quite did. People from every corner of Willow Creek filled the courthouse, some out of curiosity, others out of a quiet hunger for answers. The building itself, old and creaky, seemed to hold its breath as Evan was led inside, wrists cuffed, eyes distant. He looked thinner than before, pale from months in the county jail. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras ready to capture every expression, every movement. The prosecutors started strong, presenting Evan as a man pushed over the edge. He said Evan had argued with Martin Hale about payment for a repair job, that his frustration had built up until it turned to violence. According to the prosecution, Evan broke into the antique shop late that night to confront Martin and things got out of hand. They showed the jury photos of the crime scene, the broken glass, the overturned furniture, the blood on the floor. Each image seemed to paint Evan in darker shades. The defense took a quieter approach. Evan's lawyer, a woman from a nearby city, told the jury there was no real evidence tying him to the murder. The fingerprints, she said, came from legitimate repair work done days before. The missing money and coins didn't make sense either. Evan had no history of theft, no record of violence. She pointed out that there were no witnesses, no security footage, and no murder weapon found. Her voice was calm, steady, but the weight of the town's suspicion pressed against every word. Witness after witness took the stand. Some claimed they had heard shouting near the antique shop that night, though none could identify the voices. One man said he saw a shadow moving across the alley behind the store, but he couldn't be sure who it was. Another swore he had seen Evan walking toward the shop earlier that evening, though under cross-examination, he admitted it could have been someone else. Each testimony blurred the line between truth and rumor. Throughout it all, Evan barely reacted. He sat motionless, hands folded, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the judge's bench. The jurors stole glances at him, searching for any sign of remorse or fear, but found only emptiness. Some took that as guilt, others saw a man broken by the weight of his situation. Outside the courthouse, the town's mood turned restless. The case had divided Willow Creek in half. Some believed Evan was being framed or misunderstood, while others insisted the police had caught the right man. The local paper ran headlines that read more like verdicts than news, fueling gossip and resentment. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. The prosecution's story was simple, almost too simple. The defense's case made sense, but lacked the emotional pull to sway a jury that wanted closure. Each side clung to their version of events, but no one seemed entirely sure what the truth really was. When the closing arguments ended, the air felt thick, people with uncertainty. Evan was led away in silence, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hall. The jury would now decide his fate, and the town waited, restless and uneasy, for the verdict that would change everything. The courthouse was packed on the morning the verdict was set to be read. Even people who had no connection to the case found excuses to be there. Some stood outside in the cold, waiting for updates, clutching their phones and coffee cups. Inside, the tension was almost physical. You could feel it in the way people whispered, in the creak of the old wooden benches, in the sharp echo of footsteps down the aisle. Evan Brooks was led in by two deputies, dressed in a wrinkled shirt and dark slacks that hung loosely on his frame. His eyes stayed on the floor as he took his seat beside his lawyer. The jury filed in slowly, faces pale and unreadable. The judge asked if they had reached a decision, and the foreman stood, holding a folded piece of paper that suddenly seemed to weigh more than anything else in the room. The words came out steady but heavy, guilty. For a moment, silence filled the space, thick and unbroken. No gasps, no whispers, just the sound of the verdict hanging in the air like a final note. Evan didn't move. He didn't blink. His lawyer turned toward him, her face a mix of shock and heartbreak, but he stayed perfectly still as though the words hadn't reached him yet. The judge began to speak, reading the sentence aloud, 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 10. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, quiet but sharp, the sound of collective disbelief. As the judge's words faded, something changed in Evan's posture. His shoulders tensed, his breathing deepened, and his hands clenched against the table. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift no one noticed right away. Then, suddenly, he slammed both fists down so hard that the wooden surface cracked. The entire room jumped. His chair scraped back, his face contorted into something unrecognizable, and a guttural roar tore through the silence. It didn't sound like anger or fear, it was something deeper, raw, as if every emotion he had buried since the day of his arrest erupted all at once. Papers flew from the defense table. The bailiff rushed forward, followed by 2 officers, but Evan's outburst was explosive. He kicked over a chair, knocked a glass of water to the floor, and shouted words no one could fully make out. Reporters at the back of the room scrambled to capture the chaos, cameras clicking as the courtroom dissolved into disorder. The judge's gavel struck repeatedly, his voice calling for calm, but it was useless. It took 3 men to restrain Evan. He struggled violently, his face red, veins bulging along his neck, his voice breaking into incoherent cries that echoed long after he was pulled toward the door. As he was dragged away, he twisted once to look at the jury, his eyes wild, almost animal. That image burned into the minds of everyone there, the quiet handyman turned convicted murderer, losing control as justice was handed down. The video of the moment spread quickly. By evening, it was on every news station, replayed in slow motion, analyzed by commentators who had never met him. Some said it was proof of guilt, that he had finally shown his true nature. Others thought it was the breakdown of an innocent man who had been pushed too far. Either way, Willow Creek would never forget that day, the day the verdict was read and the defendant went mad before their eyes. In the weeks that followed Evan Brooks's courtroom outburst, the town of Willow Creek couldn't stop talking about it. The video of him slamming the table and shouting went viral online, bringing unwanted attention to the small, quiet town. News vans parked along Main Street, and reporters interviewed anyone who would talk. Some described Evan as a violent man who finally showed his true colors, while others insisted something about the whole trial never felt right. Behind the noise of headlines and gossip, one man couldn't let go of that same uneasy feeling. Detective Raymond Cole had retired from the Willow Creek Police Department 2 years before the murder. He had seen enough cases to know when something didn't add up, and this one didn't. Sitting in his small home office, he re-watched the crime scene footage over and over. There was something about the evidence that bothered him, the way the furniture was scattered, the pattern of the broken glass, the missing cash box that never turned up. It all seemed too neat, as if the crime had been staged. He decided to take a closer look, unofficially. Pulling a few old connections, he got access to the surveillance footage from a shop across the street from Holly's Antiques. The video was grainy, recorded by an old camera that barely worked at night, but it showed enough. Around 11:40 p.m., just minutes before the clock in the shop stopped, a figure appeared in the frame. The person was wearing a dark jacket and walked with a noticeable limp. Evan Brooks didn't have a limp. Cole froze the footage, leaning closer to the screen. He remembered Martin Hale once mentioning a silent business partner named Roy Larkin. Roy had invested money in the antique store but rarely showed up in public. When Cole checked old records, he found something strange. Roy's name had disappeared from several town documents shortly before Martin's death. That wasn't just unusual, it was deliberate. Digging deeper, Cole contacted a friend at the state records office. Within days, he discovered that Roy Larkin had sold his property and left town the day after the murder. His trail led to a neighboring state where he was living under a false name. Cole passed everything to the authorities, and soon a quiet investigation began to unfold behind the scenes. When police finally tracked Roy down, he was staying in a rundown apartment complex under the name Robert Lang. During the search, they found a revolver hidden in a vent behind the stove. Forensics confirmed it matched the type of weapon used in Martin's killing. In a locked drawer, they discovered something even more damning: the missing cash box from Holly's Antiques, along with several of the rare coins that had supposedly been stolen during the robbery. Roy tried to run when officers came for him, but it was too late. Confronted with the evidence, he confessed that he and Martin had argued over money. When tempers rose, Roy shot him, panicked, and tried to make it look like a break-in. Evan's fingerprints on the repaired door made him the perfect scapegoat. The news broke within hours. Reporters who had once called Evan a murderer now scrambled to rewrite their stories. Willow Creek was stunned. The town that had condemned him suddenly found itself questioning everything: its justice, its trust, and its own conscience. For the first time in months, the truth had surfaced, but it carried a weight that no one could shake. Evan Brooks had been innocent all along, yet the damage done to his life and mind could not be undone. When the day finally came to clear Evan Brooks's name, the courthouse felt heavy with guilt. The same people who had packed the room months earlier to watch him be convicted now sat in silence, their faces pale and uneasy. The wooden benches that once creaked with excitement and judgment were now filled with shame. Outside, reporters gathered again, but this time their tone was different. They weren't chasing a scandal, they were chasing redemption. Evan walked into the courtroom flanked by 2 guards, though there was no longer a need for them. He looked older, thinner, and somehow hollow. His eyes had lost their focus, like someone who had been staring into a storm for too long. The judge spoke softly, acknowledging the mistake, reading the official statement that declared Evan innocent of all charges. Every word echoed through the room, slow and deliberate, but Evan didn't react. He stood motionless, staring at the floor as if the words couldn't reach him. The prosecution offered an apology, the defense lawyer nodded in quiet triumph, and the crowd sat frozen in the weight of their own regret. The same jurors who had sentenced him looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The judge continued, explaining that the real killer, Roy Larkin, had confessed and that Evan would be compensated for his wrongful imprisonment. It was supposed to be a moment of closure, but there was no sense of victory. What should have been justice felt like something hollow and delayed. As the hearing ended, the judge told Evan he was free to go. There was a brief silence, then the scrape of chairs as people began to stand. Evan didn't move at first, he just stood there, hands at his sides, breathing slowly. Then, without warning, a strange sound escaped his lips, a low chuckle that grew louder. It wasn't joyful or bitter, it was unsettling. The laughter built until it filled the entire courtroom. People turned in their seats, unsure what to do. The guards stepped forward, hesitant. Evan's laughter echoed off the walls, high and sharp, like glass breaking in an empty house. Tears streamed down his face, but he kept laughing, the sound twisting between relief and madness. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. He took one deep breath, wiped his face, and looked around the room. His eyes, empty yet piercing, met those of the judge, the jury, and finally his lawyer. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The doors closed behind him, and no one followed. That was the last time anyone saw Evan Brooks in Willow Creek. Some said he packed up his few belongings and left town that night, driving west until the road ran out. Others claimed they saw him wandering the woods behind his old house, silent as a ghost. The town moved on eventually, but the story never really died. People still whispered about him in the diner, in the barber shop, at the grocery store, how a quiet man was broken by a lie, how justice had come too late to matter. Years later, the old courthouse still carried the echo of his laughter, faint but unforgettable. For those who had been there, it was more than a sound. It was a reminder of what happens when truth arrives after the damage is already done.